I think that what we've seen is that Putin is, and it has to be said, I mean, Putin is in so many ways a very mediocre figure. But if he has a skill, it is precisely, and he himself has called it this, his capacity to basically operate with, and more to the point, on other people. He is quite a good manipulator. And there were people within his own administration who were actually concerned the first time he had this phone conversation with Trump that sort of started this whole process of normalization.
How would you sum up, Mark? Is it even possible to sum up the current state of the relationship between Putin and Trump? Because you hear different people with very different takes on it. I mean, you rightly pointed out in your piece in the Sunday Times yesterday that actually in his first term, Donald Trump was far more hawkish towards Russia than even President Obama was. And, you know, Russian sources saying Trump is no friend of ours. On the other hand, you have people who say that, Trump has long admired Putin and the way he operates. And of course, he sided with Putin over his own intelligence agencies in 2018. So what is the truth of their relationship at the moment? Do we even know?
Well, of course, again, like all of these things, the honest answer is, and it's incredibly unsatisfying to give, and no doubt for your listeners to hear, me saying, look, we don't know for sure. However, what I would say is, look, Trump seems to have a fascination with the strongmen, the authoritarian leaders, and he scarcely seems to have met any that he doesn't like, whether we're talking about Xi in China, whether we're talking about Erdogan in Turkey, or whether we're talking about Putin. And, I'm not about to go through the thankless task of trying to psychoanalyze Donald Trump, but nonetheless, there does seem to be this desire to be sort of, in the strongman club. And also, look, they look at the world the way he does. He has this essentially quite almost 19th century vision of the world, that there's a handful of countries that really matter. And everyone else, the only question is who gets to tell them what to do. And I think that's part of the reason for his very brutal treatment of Ukraine. From his point of view, Ukraine needs to know that it's bought and paid for by Washington, and he will hammer them until they come to heel. So there are kind of reasons why he feels, shall I say, some kind of affinity with Putin. But ultimately, he stands for Donald Trump. I mean, he sided with Putin over his own intelligence services, but that's because it was to his convenience, because he was siding with Putin on the question of whether or not his first election had in any way been helped by Russian intelligence activity. So when it comes down to it, the Russians know that they have to be careful. And I think that what we've seen is that Putin is, and it has to be said, I mean, Putin is in so many ways a very mediocre figure. But if he has a skill, it is precisely, and he himself has called it this, his capacity to basically operate with, and more to the point, on other people. He is quite a good manipulator. And there were people within his own administration who were actually concerned the first time he had this phone conversation with Trump that sort of started this whole process of normalization, that he might push too far, that he might mishandle Trump. In fact, he turns out that he seems to have been pitch perfect in his combination of flattery and insinuation and so forth. And we've seen, from the experiences of everyone from Sir Keir Starmer all the way through to Volodymyr Zelensky, when you're in the court of King Donald, how you're expected to behave. And Putin manages to hit sort of, on the one hand, at kind of slightly sort of clubby macho-ness that more or less, again, is saying to Trump, yes, you're one of the tough guys club, but also flattering him and fluffing him along. So, he feels happy. The question is, of course, that's all very well, but it can't obscure the fundamental realities of the situation. In the first phone conversation, in some ways, Putin had nothing to lose, because relations between Russia and the West and Russia and the United States were at their lowest ebb since, well, frankly, in many cases, I would say the worst of the Cold War. Now, though, he has something to lose. And he has a very, very specific proposal on the table. And he has an American president who, with one eye on the potential for a Nobel Peace Prize, wants to be moving fast. He's got, from his point of view, I imagine, and this is obviously guesswork, I imagine he feels, look, I've got Ukraine on side now. I've beaten them until they'll go along with what I say. Now it's your turn. And that is going to be the tricky thing for Putin, because you can dance and flatter and weave a certain amount, but when it comes down to it, if you're being asked, So are you going to accept the ceasefire or not? There's only so many caveats with a Trump that you can actually bring into the conversation.
And of course, even were he to accept the ceasefire, that is only the beginning of what will end up being presumably quite a lengthy process when you then have to have these conversations about what a lasting peace would look like. And how do you currently assess the prospect of any kind of peace agreement being signed? Because publicly, at least, the Kremlin is still making these maximalist territorial claims over Ukraine, even unoccupied parts of Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be cautious in the sense of, again, it's a classic Russian style of negotiation that you always push ridiculously high demands because you know you're going to be haggled down, and in some ways you hope to average out somewhere high. We can just as easily look, for example, at the Russian rhetoric before, say, Finland joined NATO. That actually Putin was threatening all kinds of things, including actually military action. And then Finland joined NATO nonetheless, and nothing happened. And basically they said, well, that's up to Finland, nothing to do with us. So the Russians have no problem pivoting very, very quickly. They don't get embarrassed by that point. So look, it's very hard to tell. I mean, all I can really say is there are clearly people advising Putin who understand the situation and understand full well that, for example, while I think it's pretty clear that the Russians have no intention of abandoning any of the territory they've conquered, nor can they honestly expect the Ukrainians to withdraw from the regions that Russia is claiming through annexation with absolutely no legal basis, whatever. So, look, certainly Putin is being given the advice. Whether he truly listens to the advice is another matter. I think, to be honest, I suspect that the current front line, or basically wherever the troops are, will be the de facto border, even if it's not recognized internationally. The real areas for debate are going to be the shape of Ukraine, the rump Ukraine that is left. Is it barred from joining NATO? Putin would want to say absolutely so. He doesn't seem to have a problem with them joining the European Union, though. Is there going to be some kind of attempt to demand that the Ukrainians limit the size of their armed forces? Again, I think that will be an absolute non-starter for the Ukrainians, but we don't know how far Putin will push on that. So I think this is it. I mean, that's where I think the real area for dispute and debate is. And, of course, reparations. The Ukrainians are going to demand reparations. I cannot see a scenario in which Putin is actually going to provide reparations, but there is mileage with all the money, the Russian state money, that is frozen in the West. We may well see the Russians essentially saying, off the record, but nonetheless saying, okay, you take that and you give it to the Ukrainians, and that can be our reparations. So there is potential mileage, but as you absolutely rightly say, this is just the first stage. If the ceasefire happens, which is still a big if, all we may get then is talks about talks. We're nowhere near the point in which we actually get proper peace negotiations. And still, if I had to come down, I would say still it is at best 50-50 if that's going to happen this year.
And how do you think the Kremlin view what Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, has been promoting in recent weeks, this idea of a coalition of the willing, Downing Street saying potentially more than 30 countries could be part of it, keeping the peace in Ukraine? Is that a non-starter if you're Putin?
I mean, I think it's a non-starter from everyone's point of view, quite frankly. And certainly it's got a lot of derision in the Russian press. Now, again, to a degree, that's their job. But I think what's absolutely clear is that from the Russians' point of view, first of all, these troops will not be called peacekeepers. Peacekeepers is a very sort of technical term. It's about forces which are there under some kind of international mandate, like, say, the United Nations. If there are going to be peacekeepers, the Russians will have the chance to and will say, no, these can't just simply be NATO members. I mean, their view is otherwise at the moment. This looks like a NATO battle force under any other name. Generally speaking, it can only happen. And Emmanuel Macron, I think, is fudging this issue slightly, but that's because he knows his bluff is not going to be called. But Sir Keir Starmer has made it very clear that these would only be in the context of an agreement. They're not going to just sort of roll in there and just simply try and impose a peace. So in other words, the Russians will get to say yes or no. And at the same time, we know that they're at the moment talking about this only in the context of whether or not they have American backing, the so-called American backstop, which could be just simply in terms of American communications and logistics support. But frankly, they're more suggesting that actually it should be America's willingness to come in and basically bail them out if the Russians ignore them and roll in anyway. Now, that is, in effect, asking the United States, are you willing to go to war with Russia in this context? And I see no evidence that Donald Trump is at all interested in that. Quite the opposite, actually. On the whole, the White House is signaling that they really don't see any role for them. They've made it very clear that they think this is Europe's job to deal with. So, in effect, it sounds as if both Moscow and Washington are going to have a veto. So whatever gets brought together in this coalition of the willing, it still feels to me a bit like fantasy football. Coming up with your own imaginary team for a game that's never actually going to happen on a pitch.